Welcome to The Debate. Today we are looking at, well, really, one of the most monumental periods of knowledge transfer in all of human history. I'm talking about the Abbasid Translation Movement.
Oh, absolutely massive. We're talking about an unprecedented volume of Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge being systematically translated into Arabic over just a few centuries.
Right, and our central question today is pretty straightforward, but the answer is definitely not. We need to analyze this. Was this massive intellectual undertaking a deliberately planned top-down state project, like designed to build a grand civilization, or, was it just an organic, decentralized, and fundamentally messy sociocultural process?
And I will be taking the latter position. I argue that viewing this as some centralized, progress-oriented grand plan is, well, it's an illusion. It was actually a deeply organic, decentralized market. It was driven entirely by the pragmatic needs of individual actors.
And I completely disagree. I argue that the translation movement was a highly structured, purposeful, state-driven plan, and it was absolutely essential for building the robust Abbasid Empire.
Well, let's get right into it then.
Yeah, let's start here. When we look at monumental human achievements, right, we usually picture a grand blueprint. Think of the construction of a massive, sprawling city.
Sure.
Someone has to draw the grid. Someone has to lay out the zoning laws, direct the labor. There's a comforting logic to it, this idea that grand civilizations are built deliberately, from the top down, with a clear vision of the future.
I mean, it's a nice story.
But it's true. When the Abbasid revolution overthrew the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th century, they weren't just passively taking over an existing apparatus. They were fundamentally constructing a new kind of empire.
Right.
So they needed a robust, highly functioning state administration. And to get that, they deliberately laid the architectural framework for a massive intellectual highway system.
Okay, the city analogy is great, I'll give you that. But when you look at a city that actually feels alive today, you realize the most vibrant, enduring neighborhoods were never planned by a central architect.
Well,
They weren't. They emerged organically. A merchant sets up a stall to meet a local need. A dirt road forms simply because people keep walking the exact same path to the market every day. And suddenly, you have this complex, breathing ecosystem that no single central authority could have ever designed.
but you can't have those vibrant neighborhoods without the state first building the aqueducts and the defensive walls.
I disagree that it started with the state's vision.
Come on, we see clear, undeniable state-level orchestration from the very beginning of the Abbasid era. Look at the deliberate transfer of Sassanid statecraft. They took these dense administrative texts from Persian and moved them into Arabic. This wasn't done for the sheer joy of reading. It was a targeted acquisition of bureaucratic technology. The state desperately needed to know how to run a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, so they explicitly commissioned translations on taxation, military organization, court protocol.
I don't dispute that the state had administrative needs. Of course they did. But when we look back at history, it is incredibly tempting to fall into this, well, a teleological illusion.
A teleological illusion. Let's unpack that for a second.
Yeah.
You mean the trap of looking at the end result, like this massive library of preserved Arabic texts, and assuming that building that library was the conscious goal from day one?
Precisely that. We look at the impressive end result and assume someone must have planned it all perfectly from the beginning. But calling this a centralized, progress-oriented grand plan is simply anachronistic.
How so?
Because what we are actually looking at is a deeply organic, multi-layered sociocultural preference. It was not a top-down mandate. The sheer longevity and diversity of the movement prove this.
You don't think the Caliph sustained it?
Not alone. It wasn't just sustained by caliphs issuing edicts from some throne room. It was driven by a vast, decentralized network of actors with highly pragmatic and, frankly, often selfish micro-targets.
Right, you're talking about the private actors.
Exactly. We're talking about elite military commanders, merchants, scientists.
And extremely wealthy private families.
Families like the Buktashai or the Banu Musa, yeah.
Yes, the Buktashu, the Taifuri, the Serapion. These were private, wealthy actors, many of them Syriac Christians, actually. And they spent vast, unimaginable fortunes to fund translations out of their own pockets.
Sure, they contributed. They were a massive part of it, and they weren't doing it to build some theoretical Islamic enlightenment. They did it to protect their own social status, to maintain their professional monopolies, and to secure their immense wealth. This was a social-cultural market functioning on private demand. It was not a state-mandated curriculum.
Okay, but let's look at why that private market existed in the first place. I maintain that the state's practical requirements provided the absolutely necessary blueprint for all of that.
The blueprint again.
Yes, the blueprint. To collect the kharaj, which is the vital land tax that funded the entire empire, the state desperately needed precise land measurement.
Right.
And that necessitated the translation of complex Greek geometry to determine the exact times for daily prayers across completely different longitudes. They needed advanced astronomy. They needed it to manage a vast agricultural calendar, too.
I'm not denying the utility.
But the point is, the Abbasid administration funded and prioritized these massive foundational translations. Without this planned state-sponsored infrastructure, those private actors you just mentioned, they would have had no foundation to build upon.
But who is actually walking on that highway you keep talking about? You're assuming the highway was surveyed, planned, and paved from some central command center.
Because it essentially was.
I'm arguing the process was a decentralized multi-actor bazaar. You have different ethnic and religious groups, Syriacs, Persians, Indians, Christians, Jews. They are all intersecting.
Intersecting and working for the state.
Working for themselves. When we think of translation today, we just think of Google Translate, right? Or copying a book word for word. But for the listener to really grasp this era, we have to understand the mechanics.
The mechanics of the actual translation, you mean?
Yeah, translating complex Greek medicine or philosophy was closer to adapting a massive software program for a totally new operating system. You had to invent the code, like the actual Arabic vocabulary, as you went.
Which makes it an incredibly expensive and labor-intensive process.
Exactly.
You had to physically send envoys to Byzantium. You had to negotiate the release of ancient manuscripts, transport them safely across hostile borders, and then, pay teams of multilingual scholars to puzzle over Greek terms that had no existing equivalent in Arabic.
Right, and
that requires state-level logistics. You cannot do that from a bizarre stall.
It requires logistics, yes. But the mechanism driving it was often entirely personal. Let's look at how a translation actually took place on the ground.
Okay, let's hear it.
A Syriac Christian physician doesn't spend years translating a dense Greek medical text by Galen into Arabic because the Caliph drew a blueprint for an intellectual highway. He translates it because he wants to secure his highly lucrative position at the court against a rival Persian physician.
Right, so he introduces a new, highly advanced pulse theory from Galen that the Persian physician doesn't know.
Exactly.
He uses it to cure a prominent courtier's stomachache, and suddenly he has a monopoly on treating the elite. I know the dynamic.
But explaining that mechanism is crucial here. The Bookshuti's Shu family essentially ran a multi-generational medical cartel.
A cartel is a strong word, but yeah, they were powerful.
How did they hold on to that power? By hoarding the best Greek medical translations strictly within their own family network. It's closer to corporate espionage and proprietary technology than it is to a public education initiative. They were fulfilling immediate, practical demands on the ground. If it had merely been a top-down state highway project, it would have collapsed the moment the state's budget shifted, or the second a less intellectually curious caliph took power. But it survived for over 2 centuries because the grassroots demand was insatiable.
Okay, I see the mechanics of that, and I don't deny that personal ambition played a massive role. But who built the arena where that competition took place? The state did.
I think you're giving the state too much credit.
Well, if we want to look at whether the state was actively engineering culture and sustaining a grand vision, we have to look beyond just practical medicine or land taxes.
Where else would you look?
We have to look at how translation was utilized as a deliberate ideological tool. Think of it like reverse engineering a captured weapon to use it against its creator.
Reverse engineering a weapon? How so?
Look at the early Abbasid era. Caliph al-Mahdi specifically ordered the translation of Aristotle's Topics. Why?
To win arguments.
Well, yes. The Abbasid state was cosmopolitan. It was filled with sophisticated Christian and Jewish scholars who were deeply well-versed in Greek dialectics.
Right.
When the theological debates happened at court, Muslim scholars were finding themselves totally outmaneuvered by the structural logic of their opponents. So al-Mahdi needed to equip Muslim scholars with the exact same tools of dialectical logic, known as jadal in Arabic.
They jadal, yes.
So they could rationally defend Islam in these rigorous debates. The state was consciously downloading Greek logical software to upgrade its own theological defense system. If that isn't a macro-level planned strategy, I don't know what is.
I understand the appeal of that narrative, but I think it's dangerous.
Dangerous?
We have a terrible habit in history of fetishizing surviving texts. And we take single historical anecdotes and place them at the absolute center of our historical narratives. You're looking at the translation of Aristotle's Topics and building this massive, homogeneous grand narrative around it.
But it's not just a single anecdote. The translation of Greek logic fundamentally altered Islamic theology. It paved the way for the Mu'tazilite movement.
The rationalists, sure.
Right, a school of theology that championed rationalism. And the Abbasid state explicitly adopted Mu'tazilite theology as its official stance for a significant period. That is state planning.
Yes, but let's talk about why they adopted it and how they justified it, which brings us to the famous historical account of Caliph al-Mamun's dream.
Oh, the dream, right. So, according to the accounts, al-Mamun has this vivid dream where he actually meets Aristotle himself.
Just hanging out in his sleep.
Right? They have a philosophical dialogue where Aristotle confirms that reason and divine revelation are fundamentally aligned. And my point is, by elevating Aristotle like that, the state was actively engineering a culture that valued Greek rationalism, thereby legitimizing its own authority. The state wasn't just translating words, it was translating authority.
And that exact story is precisely why we need to be highly critical of how we analyze this history.
Why?
Because al-Mamun's dream wasn't the catalyst for a planned intellectual movement. It was a post-hoc piece of political propaganda. It was designed to justify an organic process that was already happening all around them.
You think it was just a PR spin?
Absolutely. The Abbasid state was retroactively trying to take credit for and control of a decentralized sociocultural phenomenon. They needed to legitimize their Mu'tazilite theology, so they conveniently circulate the story about the Caliph chatting with Aristotle in his sleep.
But even if we assume the dream is entirely fabricated, it still proves my point.
How does that prove your point?
It proves the state deliberately utilized the concept of translation as a cohesive ideological tool. They understood the power of the movement, and they actively steered it to centralize their own religious and political authority.
Steered it? I think they were just trying to hold on for dear life.
Oh, come on.
The reality of the translation movement was far more fragmented and messy than some neat philosophical alignment with Aristotle. If this was a unified state curriculum, how do you explain the massive volume of astrological texts translated from Sassanid Zoroastrian traditions?
Well, astronomy and astrology were deeply intertwined back then. The state needed astronomers to track the stars for timekeeping, and astrology just came along for the ride.
It didn't just come along for the ride. Sassanid astrology was political forecasting. It was fundamentally about predicting the rise and fall of empires.
Okay, but
Think about it. If you translate a Sassanid astrological text that says every 20 years the ruling dynasty faces a crisis based on the alignment of Jupiter, and you hand that to a political rival of the Caliph, that is a weapon.
wait, so you're saying the translations were being used subversively?
Absolutely. That's not state building. That is a political insurgency using translated texts as ammunition. Different factions, viziers, regional governors, rival families, they were commissioning translations of specific Persian horoscopes to prove the Abbasid dynasty would fall, or to legitimize their own claims to power.
That's fascinating.
It was a chaotic weapons bazaar. There was no single unified ideological vision coming from the top. It was a fragmented, hyper-competitive marketplace of ideas, where texts were translated to serve immediate political knife fights.
I hear you. And, you know, the political weaponization of astrology is a really fascinating mechanic. But I am still not convinced it dismantles the core argument.
Really?
Really, because it ignores the reality of emergent structure. Even if individual factions were competing using different astrological or philosophical texts, the aggregate result was a highly cohesive intellectual apparatus.
I still reject the cohesive label.
Let's step back and look at the sheer scale of the Abbasid Translation Movement. It is virtually unprecedented. We are talking about the translation of nearly all secular Greek knowledge available at the time into Arabic.
True, but scale doesn't automatically imply a grand plan.
A fragmented, chaotic marketplace simply does not produce a near-total transfer of a civilization's intellectual output. You don't accidentally translate the entire corpus of Galen's medicine, all of Ptolemy's astronomy, and the vast majority of Aristotle's philosophy just through a series of disconnected pragmatic microtransactions.
Well,
the sheer scale requires us to acknowledge a guiding, deliberate intention at the center. The Abbasid administration created formal institutions. They offered massive financial incentives, sometimes paying translators the weight of the book in gold, and they set a cultural tone that made this possible. It requires a sustained macro-level commitment.
that is a compelling argument. The scale is undeniably massive. But I think our very definition of civilization building is blinding us to the reality on the ground here. We really have to reject this grand civilization label entirely.
We can't just throw out the label because it's messy.
We keep trying to force this historical phenomenon into a neat, modern box of state-sponsored enlightenment.
What's the alternative box then? If it's not state-sponsored civilization building, how do you categorize a society spending millions in gold to translate foreign knowledge?
To prove how unplanned, non-teleological, and fiercely organic this environment was, we only need to look at the extreme edge cases.
Such as?
We have records of massive, highly expensive translation efforts being commissioned not for statecraft, not for theology, not for agricultural taxes, but simply out of a personal, highly specific interest in falconry.
Falconry. Wait, you're telling me people spent the equivalent of fortunes to read about hawks?
Exactly. Falconry. Wealthy individuals paying astronomical sums to track down, acquire, and translate obscure Byzantine treatises purely because they were passionate about hunting with birds.
Okay, but how does that not fit into a state-building narrative? Wealthy elites having niche hobbies is basically just a byproduct of a highly successful state.
Because it shatters the illusion of a teleological master plan. A state focused purely on grand civilization building doesn't waste critical translation resources on how to train a hawk.
Fair point. But
a living, breathing, sometimes chaotic sociocultural market does. In this society, knowledge had become the ultimate luxury good. If you were a newly wealthy merchant or a rising bureaucrat, how do you prove you belong with the old aristocratic elite? You commission a bespoke translation of a rare book.
right, as a status symbol.
It was driven by status anxiety, economic wealth, and raw human desire. When we call it a grand plan, we erase the Syriac Christian who translated a text to outshine his rival. We erase the merchant who funded a translation to look sophisticated to his peers. We erase the complex, messy human reality of how knowledge actually moves.
It doesn't the fact that knowledge became a luxury good just prove my point about the state engineering culture?
I don't see how.
The state, the caliphs, the administration, they made translations so culturally prestigious and so incredibly lucrative that a merchant felt he had to commission a falconry book just to keep up appearances. The state created the economic engine and the cultural gravity. The merchant is just caught in the orbit.
Gravity is a great word for it, actually, because gravity isn't a plan, it's just a condition.
It dictates how things move, though.
The state created wealth, yes. They concentrated power in Baghdad, yes. But assuming they planned the intellectual output is where I draw the line. They didn't direct the merchant to translate the falconry book. They didn't direct the astrologer to translate a subversive horoscope. The network grew wild, far beyond the confines of any imperial blueprint.
I think we've reached a really sharp distillation of our two perspectives here.
I agree.
If I were to summarize my view, I maintain that the Abbasid Translation Movement, while absolutely incorporating a diverse array of private actors, intense rivalries, and personal motivations, was fundamentally anchored in the deliberate, strategic planning of a central state. The Caliphate was looking to build the bureaucratic, administrative, and theological foundations of a sprawling new empire.
Right.
Whether it was the transfer of Sassanid administrative wisdom to run the tax system, or the reverse engineering of Greek dialectics to defend the faith, the state provided the necessary infrastructure. They provided the vast funding and the overarching ideological framework that made an intellectual transfer of this unprecedented scale possible.
And to summarize my opposing view, I argue that we must discard this modern, anachronistic narrative of a centralized grand project. We really need to look at the sociocultural dynamics. The movement was a complex, organic, and deeply heterogeneous web of interactions.
Driven from the bottom up.
From the bottom up and the middle out by the pragmatic, everyday needs, professional monopolies, and status anxieties of distinct cultural and religious groups. From elite families guarding their medical cartels to wealthy individuals pursuing luxury interests like falconry, it was a decentralized market of ideas. We shouldn't let post-hoc state propaganda like al-Mamun's dream fool us into seeing a master architect where there was actually just a thriving, chaotic metropolis of individual actors.
Yet looking at both the macro-level state requirements and those micro-level status anxieties, there's one profound reality we both seem to be circling.
What's that?
Whether we're looking at the need to measure land and collect taxes, or a physician trying to cure a stomach ache better than his rival, we both agree that the movement was fundamentally driven by practical utility.
Oh, 100%.
This wasn't a group of abstract philosophers sitting in a vacuum, translating texts for the sake of pure, detached curiosity.
Absolutely. Pragmatism is the engine here. The knowledge had to serve a tangible function. It had to win a theological debate, run a court, predict a political downfall, or cure an illness. Every single translation was a solution to an immediate problem.
Right, which leaves us with a much broader reflection on how we construct history itself. It forces us to question the nature of human progress. Are the monumental shifts in global knowledge the result of grand, centralized designs drawn up by visionaries in palaces?
Or are they the organic, chaotic intersection of millions of individual human desires playing out in the streets, the clinics, and the markets?
And examining those overlapping, deeply human historical networks, really understanding the mechanics of how a single translated book could make or break a career, offers us so much more to explore than a simple top-down timeline ever could.
It really does. There's just so much humanity in the messiness of it all.
It brings us right back to our opening thought. When you look at the sprawling architecture of human knowledge, do you see the blueprint or do you see the footsteps? We will leave you to draw your own conclusions. Thank you for joining us.